Time. This is a topic that I must confess I struggle with. I inherited the metaphysics class from my former colleague, Nathan Oaklander, who taught it for years and then retired suddenly when he was scheduled to teach metaphysics. And he is one of the foremost international authorities on this. If you look him up, you'll see that he's published a ton of books on it. And so he delves really deep into it, and I've included a couple of excerpts from one of his introductory texts. But this is not a topic I feel entirely comfortable with. So bear that in mind. In that respect, I am like St. Augustine, or Augustine, if you use the English pronunciation, who famously said of time, if nobody asks me, then I know what it is. But if somebody asks me, then I'm totally lost. He didn't use exactly those words. But basically, time seems to make sense until you start to examine it. And then you see that there are all these puzzles and paradoxes about it. Okay. Since at least the early 20th century, all discussions of time tend to make use of a distinction owing to this philosopher McTaggart, J.E.M. McTaggart, who argued for something that practically nobody believes. So he's not sort of studied for the reason that, you know, he proved something that everybody accepts. More like Berkeley in early modern philosophy, he's got an interesting argument for a conclusion that just about nobody accepts. And his conclusion was that time doesn't exist, that time, our apparent perception of time is just an illusion. A forebear of this, even before Berkeley, is the pre-Socratic philosopher Parmenides, who argued something similar and also argued that space doesn't exist either, so he was more extreme. But McTaggart's argument, the first stage of McTaggart's argument, uses a distinction that has now come to be called the distinction between the A series and the B series. Okay, so McTaggart says you can think of time as having two elements to it, necessarily. The first element involves the relations earlier than and later than, and he calls this the B series. So you can think of B series as time, as sort of a timeline. So if you wrote out the entire history of the universe on a timeline and wrote down all the events and stuff, you would just be presenting the B series. This is incomplete, though, because what the B series lacks is it's like a map without a "you are here" sticker. And the "you are here" sticker is the now, the present. So to complete the picture of time, you need to add now that tells you what the present is and tells you what the future is and what the past is. And once you add that, you have added the A properties, or the A series. Now, really, these are the same events. They're all events in time. So, for example, now is also a date on the timeline in the B series, which is, what is it? The 9th of January 2025, I believe. So they're one and the same event, but of course the now, in our view, is always moving. This is the time flies, you know. There's all these phrases that we use that imply that time moves, time marches on. One of the puzzles that McTaggart gets at, and that can be presented in different ways, is in what sense does time move? That seems to be the feature of time. And in fact, this is one of the points that McTaggart makes in his argument. So the key points of his argument are, first of all, he makes a distinction. This is sort of a laying the table before he gets to the argument. He says, okay, we can all agree that time can be looked at in these two different ways. There are two ways of looking at time. There's the A series that is just like the timeline, and then there's the B series, which involves a moving now, a shrinking future, a growing past, and a constantly moving present. Okay, so having said that, he moves on to his argument. The first part in his actual argument is that he says you can't have time without change. Time and change are integrally bound up together. Even if everything was static, you would still have time if you had change. You would still have change if you had time, because the time would have changed. So time and change are one and the same thing. Or at least, you can't have one without the other. Now, the next point he makes is that you can't have change without A properties. That is, if you look at just the B properties, if you look at just a complete history of the universe on laid out on a timeline, there is no change, because it's sort of an eternal fact that in 2024, Donald Trump won his second election, not third. That's a fact, but it's not a fact that changes. It's an eternal fact because it happens at that moment. It's just what's located in that moment. The B series view of time is very analogous to a map, an atlas view of space. And in fact, B theorists talk about space-time and make very clear this analogy between space and time. Instead of over there and over there, you've got earlier than, you got later than and earlier than. So different places on the map, if it's a temporal map, are earlier or later, whereas on a an atlas of a spatial atlas, it's distant in that north, south, east, and west, that kind of thing. Okay, but when you look at an atlas, you don't think, oh, it's changing. It's not changing, it stays the same. So in order for us to have change, which we believe exists, you've got to have A properties. And indeed, he makes the stronger point that there can't even be B relations, which are the earlier and later than, without the A series, without A properties, because what makes this later is that it was in the future at one point earlier than it. So he seems to suggest that B relations depend on A properties. Now, as I said, just about everybody rejects his conclusion, which we haven't got to yet. We're going to get to that in a minute. Everybody rejects his conclusion that time doesn't exist. But what they take up is this distinction between A series and B series, and they agree that one of them has to be fundamental. Now, the B theorists are going to reject different points in McTaggart's argument from the A theorist. The A theorists are going to agree with number 3. They're going to say you can't have change without A properties. In fact, that's a reason to believe in A properties, that there is a past, present, and future. Whereas the B theorists have to reject that, because they either have to reject that, or they have to say, you're right, you can't have change without A properties, and in fact, there is no change. But that seems as radical as McTaggart's view of saying that there is no time. So B theorists, what they actually do is they say, no, there is change. It's just the kind of change that McTaggart insisted it was, and that A theorists insisted it was, is just the wrong view of change. once you understand what change really is, you will see that you don't need A properties for change. Of course, the A theorists are going to disagree with point 5, because the way that McTaggart progresses is he says, no time without change, no change without A properties. You can't have B relations without A properties, but, this is the key point, the A series is contradictory. Why is it contradictory? Why is this whole idea of past, present, and future contradictory? Well, because these properties, past, present, and future, are incompatible. Some event, pick a moment in time. It can only be one of them. It cannot be all of them, because they are incompatible. If you are the present, then you cannot be the past, and you cannot be the future. You cannot be more than one atom. You cannot be more than one. But each moment possesses all three. There was a moment when the year 2000 was in the future. I remember it. There's a pulp song called Disco 2000, which was came out in the early 90s, and it said, let's all meet up in the year 2000. I still sing along to that and imagine meeting up in the year 2000. There's a Flight of the Conchords song about the robots, the humans are dead, which starts by saying it is the distant future, the year 2000. The year 2000 seemed like the distant future. There was a comic book, I don't know if it's still called this, it still exists, called 2000 AD when I was a kid, and it was a science fiction comic because the year 2000 seemed so far in the future. Okay, so there was a point when the year 2000 was in the future. And then there was a point, I remember it, I remember my dad calling up from England because it happened earlier in England, when the year 2000 started. And there were huge celebrations all around the world, and everybody was terrified because of Y2K. Which turned out not to be a problem. But probably turned out not to be a problem because of a lot of hard work by nerds, and they get no thanks because they prevented something happening rather than it happened and then they fixed it. Anyway, so there was a moment when it was future, there was a moment when it was present, and now it's in the past, we say. So each moment, the year 2000 possesses all three properties, past, present, and future. And that can't happen. They're incompatible. Now, the obvious response to this, that an atheist, so an atheist is going to say, wait a minute, McTaggart, this is stupid. They don't. No moment possesses all of those properties at once. Sure, the year 2000 was in the future. When it was in the future, it only had the property of being in the future. It didn't have the property of being in the past or the present. And then when it was present, it only had the property of being present. And now it only has the property of being the past. So it was the future in the 1980s. It was the present in the year 2000. And it's the past now. So there are so it has these different properties at different times. But then McTaggart says, but wait a minute. These are all time. So you're talking about the year 2000, which is a time, was future at another time, and present at another time, and, well, present at the year 2000, and past at other times. But each of those are also times. So they must have, to be times, they have to have temporal properties. And to have temporal properties, they have them all at once. So he says, you essentially kick the problem down the road. You're trying to solve the problem by introducing new times. Now, this is not quite the same problem, but it's this is nicely illustrated by the reading in the reading by Ted Sider, where he points out if we try to work out how time changes, the normal way we understand change is that For example, when a tomato ripens, it is green at one time and red at another. So it has different properties at different times. But if it's time that changes, it seems like we have to say that time has the property of being future at another time. So this can't be time because this is time, and this is something that is distinct from time. Well, what is this thing that is distinct from time that is in some sense also time? Well, let's call it hypertime. So time changes by being different things at hypertime. But then if hypertime is itself temporal, then it must also have these properties of changing, and therefore you get this infinite regress. Hypertime must change relative to hypertime, and and so on. So it's just very puzzling. All right. Now this puzzle recurs because you have this argument with B theorists and A theorists about change. So the B theorists say, we have our own account of change, and I'll get to that in a second. The A theorists say, but that's not really change. For change, you have to have, actual changing. To which the B theorists respond, your version of change makes no sense. It's contradictory. So that's kind of the back and forth. All right, well, let's get into that. So there are different A theorists because all A theorists believe in something called the moving now. What they disagree about is exactly what else is real. A popular current version of atheism, and I would say that this is sort of the commonsensical view. If you ask someone on the street and you gave them the terms with which to express their view of time, they would probably be presentists. And what presentism is what you might call, what I know Nathan calls, a view about the ontology of time. Ontology is a word involving being, existence. So if you have an ontology, it's your list of things that you think are real. There's a wonderful Irish sitcom called Father Ted. And if I describe the premise, it sounds just terrible because it's about three Catholic priests living on an island called Craggy Island, that is a horrible place to live off the coast of Ireland, and just the shenanigans that they get up to. It sounds god awful, but it's actually brilliant. And one of the characters is Dougal, who is a very simple soul, and Father Ted is always having to explain things to him. And he has this little pull-down chart that is obviously evidence of, a history of having arguments with Dougal about what's real and what isn't. And he says, let's check the chart, and it has like Nessie with a cross on it, and, chairs, tables, things are listed on that are real, and, things that are not real are crossed out. That's like your ontology, your list of things that are real. So the presentists' ontology, the only thing that is real is the present. The past does not exist. It's not real. Dinosaurs don't exist. Sounds right, right? We say dinosaurs don't, unless you say that chickens are dinosaurs, but all right, the dodo. The dodo does not exist. It did exist. There was a time when it existed, and that was the present. But it doesn't exist. Dodos do not exist now, at least live dodos. I think there's a few stuffed ones in museums around the world. The Natural History Museum in London, for example. So that's presentists. Presentists' view about what's real. Whereas B theorists have an interesting view about reality. Again, the simple view, another name for the typical B theorist view is that they talk about space-time. Space-time is what's real. And so space and time are analogous. So every point on this line is equally real. according to B theorists. So the year 1700, the year 0, is just as real as what we call the now. So are dinosaurs real? Yes, they are. Is the dodo real? Yes, it is. Is it real now? No, but that's by analogy to here. So the words here and now are what are called indexicals. That is, what they refer to changes depending on where they're uttered, or the time and place of their utterance. I is another indexical. I am Simon Cushing is true when I say it and false when you say it, unless you're the other Simon Cushing who is the manager of a paint company that I see when I Google my own name. And I imagine there's a few more. But so I and here and now are indexicals. Okay, so think of here. Is the Eiffel Tower here? No. Does that mean it's not real? No, of course it's real. It's just not here. They think the same way about now. Are dinosaurs and dodos now? No. Does that mean they're not real? No, it doesn't mean they're not real. They are real. They're just not now. So that's the space-time view. Now, I would say that most people would disagree with that, except people have no intuitive problem with the idea of time travel. They don't think, probably most people don't think we can do it, certainly now, but if you ask them, is it conceptually impossible? They would say no, it's possible they'll come up with it in the future. People don't sort of refuse to watch Back to the Future because they say this makes no sense whatsoever, even though Back to the Future does make no sense, and we'll get into that when we get to time travel. But, people are okay with the idea of time travel. Now, we will actually read a paper that suggests that even presentists could believe in time travel, but the easiest way to make sense of time travel is this, that you can travel back in time because it's real. You don't make it real by going there. It's real. It's just that we can't access it. So that kind of makes intuitive sense of this claim. Another aspect of this, and this is coming from the Cider book, is things have temporal parts. What does that mean? Well, according to presentists, all of reality exists in the present. Now, one of the puzzles I have about presentists, but again, I haven't done much research on it, is how long is the present? It seems to me that the present couldn't really have any length of time, because suppose it's half a second long. Well, then, relative to the leading edge of the half a second, the beginning of it is half a second in the past. So it can't all be present. So there can't be any length of time that is the present. The present has to have itself no length of time whatsoever. And that sounds to me tantamount to saying that there is no time, because the present itself has no extension in time. It is not extended in time. It's instantaneous. It is effectively zero. So that's the puzzle I have about presentism. But if you are a presentist, reality, as it were, is three-dimensional. I am a three-dimensional object. Sure, that makes sense, right? I have length and breadth and so on. Whereas B theorists, or at least the space-time theorists, can say, no, actually, I'm a four-dimensional object. And this is just a time slice of me. This is not me. This is just a part of me, a temporal part of me. It's the part that exists at this moment in time. But all of me includes every time slice of me. So I begin in 1968, July 19th, 1968, and I go on to whenever I cease to exist. I don't know, 2050, I'll be pretty decrepit by then. Maybe I'll be longing for death. Apparently, my gran lived till she was 99, and my dad reports he used to go to lunch with her every week, and she would lean across the table and say, "I long for oblivion." She had a good turn of phrase, my gran. So I don't know, but let's say I live till 2050. Okay, so if we're talking about me, I exist as a four-dimensional object that begins in 1968 and ends in 2050. This is just like a slice of the sausage. Like I'm like a time sausage, and this is just a razor-thin slice. It's a temporal part of me. You can talk about different temporal parts. Like my teenage years are a temporal part of the complete me. So now this has implications for all sorts of things, particularly personal identity, which we'll get to in the last unit of the class. Final point about the space-time theorists believe is that there's no real now. Again, with analogy with here. Suppose I call out to you, "Where are you?" And you say, "Here," off in the distance. And I say, "Well, I'm here." Which is the real here? There isn't one. There's no real here. It's just here for me is here for there is you. It's like we are, what's the real etiquette? Some people say, some cultures say that you've got to take off your shoes before you come into a house, so that you can't eat with your elbows on the table, that burping after a meal is rude. Other cultures say the opposite. Which is correct? And we would say, well, it's relative. It's relative. Same with now. So there is no real now. And that is a direct disagreement, of course, with the presentists. All right. So this is the view. These are some analogies between space and time that the B theorists are committed to. So what the B theorists say is that in reality you can make do with only the B series. Well, then so are you saying there is no such thing as past, present, and future? Well, yes, they are what is called D-tensors. Now, but then the A theorists could say, but it's just obvious. We experience the present. We directly experience time. This is called a phenomenological point. Phenomenology is the study of experience. And we could say denying that time exists is like denying that I'm having a sensation. You can't deny it. It's just so directly obvious. So that just seems to make the B theorist view ridiculous. Well, what the B theorists tend to say, I'm missing an N there, I see. This should say translatability. What the B theorists say is that anything that you can, well, here's an analogy, actually, to make the B theorist point. Here's something that we think we can directly experience, heat or cold, as today is very cold. Well, we think we can experience it. We go outside and we can experience it. On a hot day, we feel heat. On a cold day, we feel cold. So there it is. Heat and cold must really exist. But what does physics tell us that heat and cold really are? They really are actually motion of molecules. So heat is motion. That's what it really is. So you can translate anything you say about heat, you can translate into statements about the motion of the particles of the thing that makes it up. So if something feels hot to us, it just means that its particles are vibrating faster than if it felt cold. So the reality is different from the phenomenology. And that's what they say is true of time. We think we can experience the past, present, and future, but the reality is just B relations. So anything you can say that involves the tenses, past, present, and future, can be translated, at least according to this idea, into statements that only involve terms from the B series, earlier, later, or specific time locations. So that was an early detensor move. When I say early, this is all happening in the 20th century, and it's no accident. In the early part of the 20th century, everything was about, all the focus switched from the world to language. Philosophy of language was basically all the philosophy there was. Movements like the logical positivists made this happen. So they focused on, the B theorist says, if we can come up with a way of restating statements that involve tenses without involving tenses, then we've shown that the B theory is the fundamental one, and you can carry on using tenses just so long as you understand they're not real. Like we say, the sun rises in the morning. We still say that, but the sun doesn't really rise. It's just the rotation of the Earth. So that's what statements involving past, present, and future would be like on this view. The trouble is that 3 attempts they made to translate tensed statements failed, or at least had fairly significant objections to them. So one is the token reflexive view. And according to this, here's a tense statement, like January the 9th, 2025 is present. According to the token reflexive, you can say, replace that with January 9th, 2025 is simultaneous with this token. And this token is my saying of that statement. And so that can refer to a point on the timeline. But the trouble with that is that suggests that you only get time when there are tokens of statements. The same thing is a problem with the psychological theory, which was Bertrand Russell's theory. Bertrand Russell, famous British philosopher, was an early detensor. And he said that basically the flow of time, it was purely psychological. It's just happening in our minds. But that just seems counterintuitive. It seems like before there were any conscious beings, change happened, time happened. Time went on. There was, because we say there was a time before conscious beings, and then we arrived at a time when the first being became conscious. Well, so we were moving through time to get to that point. Whereas the psychological and token reflexive require there to be beings doing that. Now, someone like Berkeley might say, well, there was always God, and so God. But one of the things, actually, one of the issues about the nature of God is God in time or outside of time? It seems to make more sense to say that God is outside of time, particularly if Einstein is right and time doesn't exist without space, because God is supposed to have created the universe. So if he created the universe, he created space and time. So he can't be trapped inside his own creation, as the atheists seem to suggest. So it seems like God is atemporal. God is outside of time. If God is atemporal, then God's view of the universe is like the B theorist. It sees the complete. God is looking at the future and the past and the present, what seem that way to us, all at once. So he doesn't actually, God, doesn't actually experience change. And that's one of the reasons why some people are committed to this view, because God is supposed to be changeless. So that makes sense of that view. But of course, it also creates puzzles, like God is looking at you, what you do in your future. So God already knows what you will do in your future. And then it seems like God knew what you would do at every point in your life before he even created you. So then that kind of makes ridiculous the idea that God punishes you for doing something wrong, because he knew that you would do that. He created you knowing that you would do that, because he made the entire universe all at once, and the entire universe includes the future. So he made you a kind of creature that does that at certain points in their life. And then it's ridiculous to punish you for it, because that's the way you were made. You don't really get a chance. It's like a chair doesn't get a chance not to have 4 legs, because that's the way it's made. Anyway, so there are religious implications to these views as well. So the problem with both the token reflexive and the psychological is it seems to make time dependent on observers, whereas that doesn't seem right. Time seems to be independent of there being observers. Then there was the date analysis view that is not psychological or dependent on observers. It says, as Nathan puts it, Alice is agitated now. That's a tense statement that requires translating, if you're a B theorist, can be uttered at 12 noon, May 2nd, 1991, means, and here it is translated into tenseless language, Alice is agitated at 12 noon, May 2nd, 1991. So you can get rid of all references to now or past or present or future by just locating it at the right point on the timeline. But the trouble with that is if it's a total one-to-one translation, then every piece of information that is that you can derive from one statement, you can derive from another. But there is information in Alice is agitated now that is not included in the date analysis. For example, if I say my tooth hurts now and won't hurt in the future, that information is not captured if you just change it to my tooth hurts at 10 a.m. on January the 9th, 2025, because what if I don't know what the date and time is? I do know that it's now, and I know my tooth hurts now, but I don't know what date and time it is. So they can't mean the same thing, because if I can know one and not know the other, they can't mean the same thing. So that was a problem with the date analysis. Now, in response to this, now I'm sure there are still defenders of this method of translatability. In response to these problems, one move that the B theorists can make is say, okay, you may be right. We cannot translate all the information that is in a tensed statement into a tenseless statement. But all that means is that you can't translate. That doesn't mean that the A series is real. In fact, the A series is not real. And if you can't say it in B series language, then it's not real. So the things that the B series translations aren't capturing, it doesn't matter, because they're not real. And this is where they go on the attack. See, I've used pink to indicate criticisms and white to indicate, presenting their positive view. So presenting the positive view over here, criticizing A series here, criticizing B series here, positive view. So the new tenseless series tends to go on the attack and say that A series can't be real because it's paradoxical. And that brings us back to versions of this argument. Now, I'm sure the people involved in the argument say, no, this is an entirely new argument because the A series responds to that. But you'll find when you get into philosophical debates that the people who write on the debates, it's like fractals. You can lay out a debate and you can get the basic sense of it. And you think, okay, I think I get it. But then the cutting edge is going to be giving new versions of old arguments, but they're going to say, no, this doesn't fall into, this avoids a criticism of the old argument in this clever way. And it quickly becomes so intricate that it's hard to remain interested. Where there are people who make this their life's work, Nathan is one of them, and they can see the minute differences between the new criticism and the old criticism. So this argument from the new tenseless theory of time that a series change is circular or contradictory is given by the character of Ivan in the Passage of Time chapter in Nathan's Dialogues. That's chapter 6, pages 76 and 77. He says, Sophia is the A theorist and Ivan is the B theorist. To me, Sophia's view of time and change is going round in circles, and it never really explains how change is real or even possible. For it to explain a thing's changing its properties, she introduces time in the form of temporal becoming. Then she explains temporal becoming, or passage of time, in terms of events changing. And to complete the circle, she explains how events can change by introducing temporal becoming once again in the form of tensed facts changing their obtaining status, or propositions changing their truth value. So the old criticism is essentially that this sense of time moving doesn't make sense, because to make sense of time moving, it has to be moving relative to something, and that other thing has to be time, and then that other thing has to be moving relative to something else, and that other thing has to be time, and you get this infinite regress. And one puzzle that I think is a good challenge that the B theorists can give is say, okay, suppose you A theorists, suppose you're right, and time changes. What is the rate of change of time? We can understand, if we're talking about any other kind of change, like the change in the global temperature that is happening inexorably, we can ask what is the rate. And of course, what's terrifying is that the rate is increasing exponentially. But we make sense of the rate of change. But of course, in order to understand the rate of change, so the very notion of change involves the possibility of a rate of change. So if you're going to say time changes, there has to be a rate of change of time. But of course, that brings out this notion that you only have a rate of change when time is an index that you can compare change against. So if time itself has to change, you have to have this extra time to work out the rate of change of time. Now, the biggest, hammer in the A theorist's toolbox is just to insist, look, you can't deny something, you can't sit there and deny that the now changes. I can watch myself age at ever-increasing rates. I experience time moving. Are you just going to sit there and say that I'm crazy? What is happening? I know that I can just sit here and things change, and the future becomes the present, becomes the past. That's the phenomenology. And you can't capture that. For example, suppose I had a headache and it's over. Currently I have shingles. I'm longing for that to be over. Eventually, some point in the future, I will say, hey, I don't hurt anymore. And I'll say, thank goodness that's over. What does that mean? If you just have a point on a timeline, someone saying, thank goodness that's over, what do they mean? Do they just mean there's something at a different point on the timeline? And the A theorists can also say there's something wacky, there's something fails about this analogy of space and time. Time seems to be distinct in a way that is disanalogous to space. For example, this is their this is the major criticism of A theorists about that B theorists cannot account for change. What is change? So suppose I change in height. I changed in height most between 1968 and what? I was 16, so what? 1984, is that right? Yes, 1984. So I changed in height most between 1968 and 1984, very little thereafter. So if you look at that stretch of time, 1968 to 1984, I changed. Now, how do B theorists account for that change? What they say is, well, the change is, here you are at 6'2" in 1984, here you are at, I don't know, 10 inches or whatever. No, it'd be much longer than that, wouldn't it? I don't know. I don't know how long I was as a baby, but here I am that length. And here I'm actually a few centimeters long before I was born. If that's me, that's a question of personal identity. If I exist as a fetus, well then I start out tiny, and yet I get longer and longer and longer until I reach the height of about 6'2". Where's the change? And the B theorists say, well, the change is in the difference between 1984 6'2" me to 1 centimeter long, sometime in 1968, or even 1967, I guess. So the change is the difference. Now that's like spatial heterogeneity. So spatial heterogeneity means that you have varied landscape. Spatial homogeneity is if you're in Nebraska and everything's just flat. Spatial heterogeneity is if it's nice and hilly over here and flat over here and so there's difference, like over here it's different from over here. That's what change is according to the B theorists. Over here in 1984 it's different from over here in 1967. But that's not change, say the A theorists. Having different things at different places is not change, because it's always like that in 1984. And it's always like that in 1967. 1967 never changes. 1984 never changes. There's no thing that changes. There's just different over here from over here. What is the one thing that changes? There isn't one. That's the complaint they have about B theorists. The other thing about that is different between space and time is you can move all over a landscape. You can walk over here, you can walk over there. You can't move back and forward in time. Now, if you read the Sider article, he says, well, actually, that point is not as good as it sounds, because they're smuggling in time into the word move. And he says, Richard Taylor says, let's translate any statement that you can talk about moving in space and translate it to like at T1, you're at this location, at this, GPS location. At T2, you're at this location. And then say the same thing about in time. At T1, you're at 1967. At T2, you're at 1984. You end up sounding actually pretty similar. Finally, causes only work forwards. There is no such thing as backwards causation. Whereas causes can, one event can over here in space can cause an event over here in space, and then it can have it can affect it backwards. So you can have causes going in all directions in space, but they only work in one direction in time. Well, maybe that's just the way it appears to us. If actually time travel is possible, and apparently, according to physicists, time travel is conceptually possible, but not in our universe. That's the latest. But there are possible universes where time travel is possible. And I think there's also the idea of wormholes in our universe that might make it possible. I don't know. But if that's the case, then you do have causes moving backwards in time. So again, the B theorists have a response to this. But they don't really have a response to the phenomenological point other than to say, you're just imagining it. There is no real moving now. You're just a four-dimensional object. The stuff, the things that you do in the future, in a sense, they're laid out. And of course, another topic in metaphysics that we're going to get to that is affected by this is free will. Because the B theorists' view seems to suggest that the future is just as real as the past. And we're willing to accept that we can't change the past because it's set. But we like to believe that we can change the future. But according to the B theorists, no, there's something that you do in 2027, and it's just as real. You doing it is real in 2027 in the same way that you doing something in 2023 is real. It's real, and it is the way it is at that time. And that sounds like, well, then what's my contribution? It sounds like I don't have free will. And that does seem to be a depressing implication of the B theorist view of time, which is another thing they have to address. They have to say, no, actually, you do have free will in the ways that matter, whereas the A theorists are just looking like, on my view, the future isn't real. It's up for me to create it. That seems to allow a lot more freedom than this view. Okay, so you get a sense of the general camps and the arguments that they use against each other, and also the implications for other areas of metaphysics that this view has. Like, are objects three-dimensional or are they four-dimensional? What's the right answer? Do I exist all at once in the present, or am I a four-dimensional object? Is this just a time slice of me? We'll get to that later on when we talking about objects and persistence in time. There you go.